Hello everyone and welcome to my Zyra Mid video guide. I'm Melyn, a Zyra one-trick pony who has hit Masters and is currently Diamond 1. The intent of this guide is to be a thorough resource that people can use to answer specific questions about different aspects of playing Zyra. To this end, it will be quite long. I highly recommend using the timestamps below the video to find the section of your choice. Finally, this guide was written for patch 6.11, but my text guide found in the video description will always be updated every patch or two, so check that out if anything in the video turns out to be outdated. Let's start with the basics. There are a lot of summoner spells that you can take as Zyra Mid, and they each have their own use. The most common are Ignite and Teleport. I recommend running Ignite if you think you can snowball in the laning phase. Ignite has little use outside of early game, so if you will be avoiding fights or just trying to scale, there are better choices. I most often run Ignite into champions such as Karthus, Anivia, and Brand. Teleport is a great summoner spell for a variety of situations. You can get this when you want to scale and focus on farming, if you want to pressure side lanes without walking to roam, if the enemy lane is extremely safe leading to low kill pressure, or if you know that you will be harassed out of lane a lot. I often take Teleport against champions such as Gangplank, Twisted Fate, and Heimerdinger. These are the most common summoner spells, but there are good defensive ones to take as well, as the situation warrants. Take Exhaust if you're up against a predictable short-range burst champion such as Zed or Ryze, Heal if you want a defensive spell that gives mobility as well, or Cleanse if the enemy team has a lot of crowd control, think Lissandra, Ashe, or Twisted Fate. Barrier's in a bit of a weird spot right now, but it's a solid pickup as well. There are a lot of different summoner spell options, and you may wish to take different spells against the same champion depending on team composition and playstyle. Don't be afraid to try different things to find what works best for you. I use a few different rune pages. Two things to note before we begin looking at them. The first is that I take a mixture of health and armor seals against AD matchups due to their synergy in maximally increasing effective health. The second is that you can swap between magic penetration and AP glyphs and quints as you like. Penetration scales better against champions throughout the game, but the AP does help a bit with last hitting and turret taking. My most common rune page is 20 magic penetration with either health or armor seals depending on the matchup. I run this quite often when I have Ignite and I'm in lane and looking to go aggressive. Another page that I run quite often is my scaling page, which I run into very boring matchups so I can be as effective as possible mid-game and beyond. I don't often build very much CDR, so the scaling CDR in my glyphs helps a lot. The final common page I run is against tough AP matchups like LeBlanc and Fizz, where I run penetration in marks and quints, but health and MR in seals and glyphs. There are a lot of variations you could do with these pages as well, getting more CDR as you deem appropriate, using defensive quints, using movement speed quints against skillshot lanes like Xerath and Ziggs, or running AP instead of penetration glyphs and quints as I mentioned earlier. Again, a lot of it depends on your playstyle. Masteries are maybe one of the most straightforward decisions to make. There are 4 things to choose really, with almost no variation outside of that. The most important decision is whether to go 18 into Ferocity or 18 into Cunning. Ferocity gives you 7% magic penetration and Deathfire Touch, whereas Cunning gives scaling flat penetration and Thunderlord's Decree. The Cunning tree is almost inarguably better for Zyra's early game. The poke with Thunderlords is much stronger than the poke from Deathfire, especially since you won't be constantly poking anyway. Furthermore, the flat penetration will be better in almost all stages of the game against almost all of your enemies barring tanks. I most often choose to run Thunderlord's Decree because I like having a strong early game and it does really well even with very little AP. However, Deathfire is more useful in a late game situation where you're applying damage over time against multiple targets. The smaller choices are this: to put the remaining 12 points in the other tree, or the Resolve tree, and which second tier to take. I almost always put the 12 points into the aggressive tree that doesn't have 18 in it, with the exception of me running 12 into Resolve against very difficult matchups where the extra health regeneration, and summoner spell cooldown reduction can really come in handy. For second tier choices in Ferocity, I run Double-Edged Sword when I want to be aggressive, Feast when I'm scared and want to farm, Expose Weakness when I'm trying to scale and teamfight. In the Cunning tree, I run Secret Stash when I'm worried about getting poked out, and Assassin when I'm not. Finally, shown here is my most common mastery page. Okay, the next section is really basic. This is going to be a Melyn Champion Spotlight where I talk about Zyra's abilities, what they do, and how to best make use of them. Again, feel free to skip this if you want. Her passive spawns seeds in a range around her, similar to how Alawi spawns her tentacles. These can be anywhere in the range and have a higher chance to spawn in brushes. 2 seeds may spawn at the same time. The rate at which they spawn increases as they level up. The important thing about using her passive is to be aware of the countdown, to notice when and where the seeds are spawning. This is one of your best defenses against ganks, as you can quickly spawn a horde of plants to defend you. Her first ability is her Q, which deals damage in a smaller box and spawns plants over seeds in a larger box. This has a low cooldown and will be your main ability, both to harass and spawn seeds. It's important to note that the Q has a bit of a weird shape and will always be aimed perpendicular to your position. It may take some getting used to, so feel free to turn on ranged indicators if you normally use SmartCast. Also, I recommend using the Q before creating a seed with W, as this gives you much better plant positioning and makes it much less telegraphed as well. Zyra's W is what lets her manually place a seed, as well as very slightly increasing plant health. You will use this in your combos like the QW combo shown previously. Plants spawned by her Q have long range, while plants spawned by her E have short range but slow the enemy. The different plants deal the same amount of damage, but multiple plants of the same type deal reduced damage, so make sure you always have one of each. Furthermore, Zyra's W seeds give vision for 60 seconds, have a longer cast range than wards, and reveal champions that step on them, so they can be a great way to watch for ganks when your trinket is on cooldown, and or when you want to face check, even in long range over the wall situations. Zyra's E is her AoE root, which lasts for 0.75 seconds up to 1.75 seconds depending on rank. The most important thing about her E is to not waste it. It moves quite slowly and is fairly easy to dodge while being on a long cooldown, so you often want to Q first and then E after, despite it sounding a bit counterintuitive. With this in mind, it is often best used from Fog of War for effective ambushes. We end this section with Zyra's ultimate. There are 3 important parts to her ultimate. The first is the damage, which grows from the center when cast to the edge of the area as the animation grows. This is important to be aware of because the damage will apply quickly to targets in the middle, but will take a bit of time to reach targets on the edge. The second thing to note is the knock-up. This is separate from the damage, and enemies such as Sivir and Nocturne can only spell shield either the damage or the knock-up, not both. The final part of her ultimate is that it enrages her plants, increasing their damage by 50% and refreshing their life and duration. To see how effective this can be, check out this video of me soloing Baron. Also worth mentioning, the enraged plants look very cool. Now for plant aggro. If you do nothing, plants will naturally attack the closest target unless taunted. However, you can change their target by auto-attacking. This is important in lane and team fights to make sure your plants focus the correct targets. Still, it can be difficult to get into auto-attack range in lane. Luckily, the plants will naturally prioritize champions hit by your spells. In fact, they don't even need to be hit, just within the outside plant spawning zone of the casting reticle. We'll end this basics section with 2 highly contested topics among Zyra players, skill order and item builds. I highly recommend starting Q, as E is unreliable, has a high cooldown, and is quite telegraphed. Then get W next to have a reliable method of harassing, getting E at level 3 to have access to all of your abilities. As for maxing order, it used to be very standard to max Q into E into W for Zyra mid. However, now we see E max much more commonly and sometimes even W max second. I'll talk a bit about the merits of each line of thought as well as my own preference. Q has been changed to give only 30 extra damage and a lower cooldown upon leveling up, whereas E has 35 extra damage and a longer root duration for each level. I think the damage and lower cooldown is fairly negligible in making a decision, but the root duration increase is huge. Keeping your enemy in your ultimate and plants for a second longer will amplify your damage by a large amount. Furthermore, with the changes to Q including nerfed base and scaling in the Zyra rework, Zyra's Q is much more often relegated to a seed spawning tool, with most of her scrapping put into her E. Still, I suggest maxing Q first into matchups where you can easily harass and poke, such as Fizz, and matchups that can get out of CC, such as Gangplank. An E-Max is more beneficial in matchups with a lot of all-ins, where you want to lock the enemy inside your plants, such as LeBlanc and Azir. As for the rest of the skills, I highly recommend maxing W last. The increased tankiness from higher levels is almost non-existent. It still takes the same amount of auto attacks level 1 and level 5, and they still die almost instantly to Morgana W or Rumble Q. If you want to max W second, do it for the lower cooldown of seed spawns. Still, I do not recommend this, as you have access to seeds from your passive anyway, and the damage increase as well as cooldown or root duration increase from Q or W simply is more effective. Some Zyras do this, so I'll present it as an option. Alright, time for item builds. The most important thing about item builds is identifying what kind of playstyle you want and how to best fit both in your team composition and the enemy team composition. Zyra can be a burst mage, a tank killer, and a poke mage quite successfully and with radically different builds. I'll start with my most common build and then introduce two alternatives, and close with situational items and other options. My most common build is double Doran's Ring into Luden's Echo, Sork Shoes, Void Staff, Liandry's, Deathcap, then Morellonomicon or Rylai's as the situation warrants, playing Zyra primarily as a poke mage. With this build, one QW will do an absurd amount of damage, even to tanks. With Rylai's, it will also help to do an AoE slow that can be extremely effective in helping your team engage. The reason for such a late Morellonomicon is that I don't believe Zyra needs it for the mana. The reason to get Morellos is the great gold efficiency of the CDR and ability power, not to mention grievous wounds, but I like to spike earlier, and a Luden's Rush will give you that spike. I find CDR much more important in a late game scenario than early game, hence why I also run scaling CDR instead of flat. This build focuses on abusing your poke early game, but has difficulty dealing with tanks until mid to late game. If you're against a team with a lot of tanks, I recommend building Morellos, Sork Shoes, Void Staff, Liandry's, Rylai's, then Deathcap. The early CDR and penetration will help you take down their tanks much more quickly. Your poke will suffer a bit without the Ludens, but your sustained damage will skyrocket. With the Zyra changes in 6.9 making Zyra's plants the core of her kit and nerfing the damage on her Q, I think Zyra's identity as a burst mage has been hurt. But if you want, that path is still open and can be quite effective. For this build, do Protobelt, Sorks, Void, Deathcap, Ludens, and then Morellos. So these are three very solid builds, but there are numerous variations that you might get based on matchups, specifically against difficult AD or AP matchups. If you're worried about getting destroyed by a LeBlanc or other AP assassins, rushing a Negatron Cloak into Rod of Ages into Abyssal gives you a very large amount of tankiness, as well as preserving some of your damage, though this does delay your power spike by a lot. You can then finish with Void Staff, Ludens, Deathcap, or something else as you see fit. Against difficult AD matchups such as Zed, an early Zhonya's Hourglass can do wonders. Again, finish the build like one of the above. The most important thing when trying to survive a difficult matchup is to be aware that the best way to stay alive is to build both resistances and health, not just one or the other. Building Zhonya's and then no health items will still result in a very dead Zyra very quickly. If you feel the need, Liandry's and Rylai's are amazing health items that fit Zyra very well. The final note I want to make about builds is that you'll notice how early I get Void Staff in all of these builds, regardless of how much MR the enemy team has. That's because for Zyra, who has high base damages, penetration is the most efficient stat for her to build. If you want to maximize your all-in combo, meaning one rotation of spells, build as much magic penetration as you can and always build Void Staff before Deathcap, especially if you aren't worried about wave clear, and especially, but not only, if the enemy team is building MR. The only time magic penetration is not worth it is if you have more penetration than the enemy team has MR. There's plenty more to talk about with builds, but I think this has gone on long enough. Check out my text guide for more builds and item discussion, or ask me on my stream. For the next part of this guide, I want to talk about playing Zyra mid in various stages of the game, starting with the early laning phase. Zyra's level 1 is quite weak unless she gets lucky with her passive. Try to spawn seeds while waiting for the minions to reach the lane and attack minions as quickly as possible in order to reach level 2 first. This will be the entire first wave and one melee minion in the second wave. Once you hit level 2, you are one of the strongest mid laners in the game. Feel free to harass your opponent with a QW combo whenever they try to last hit, making them choose between CS and harass. This is one of the best ways to be aggressive. Always watch the health of your minion wave. One of the most important things, especially in the early laning phase, is to be aware of how minion waves work, and don't push the wave unnecessarily. I won't give a full explanation here, but the idea is you want the wave close to your turret without being under your turret. This leaves your opponent vulnerable to ganks and protects you from them. Don't be afraid to take a break from harassing if you find the minion wave is building up too quickly. A lot of times the amount I harass is more defined by how many minions I have than the health and strength of my opponent, as Zyra's harass will naturally push a wave. Luckily, this means it's very easy to freeze an incoming minion wave as well. This should be most of your early laning phase. Try to keep the wave near your turret, harass when you can, and focus on farming. The single biggest advice I can give to 90% of League players is just to work on your last hitting. It doesn't matter if you chunk the enemy to 50% of their health if you aren't getting the CS, which counts for an incredible amount of gold. The laning phase gets a lot more interesting once you hit level 6. By this time, you have pretty good wave clear with a QE combo, and you can turn a gank into an even lane by intelligently utilizing your passive seeds in your ultimate. Before 6, I mostly focus on harassing and farming. It's usually at this point where I look to impact the map or capitalize on an advantage mid. If you're looking to kill your opponent, poke their health down a bit with a few QW combos, then watch for their CS tendencies and attempt to land an E when they walk for a cannon or ranged minion. Once it lands, unleash your full combo, usually EWR/QW. In an all-in fight, it's very important to be aware of what rank your E is, and to not waste your ultimate and Q if they're only rooted for the 0.75 seconds. If you don't think you can kill your opponent due to being outranged, them playing extremely safe, or being an incredibly boring laner like Gangplank, you can look to roam. Quickly clear the wave with QWEQ combo and threaten to roam top or bot if they're overextended. I specifically say threaten because sometimes you don't want to walk the whole way there. Moving into the Fog of War does a few things for you. You can watch the lane to see if they know you're coming, such as if it's warded or if your opponent pings you, and save yourself a wasted trip. If it's not warded, you can either roam and get kills or watch to see if your opponent follows you, in which case you can often land a successful ambush and get kills or some summoners. Remember that Zyra excels in ambushes. The last comment I want to make about laning phase is what to do if you're losing. Statistically, you should expect to lose about half the time, so knowing what to do when you're losing and how to help your team win the game is one of the most important things to know. If you can't go to lane without dying, simply farm under turret and wait for the wave to push, even if it means missing CS. If the wave is frozen near the opponent's tower, ask your jungler to help you reset it. If you're getting dove, ward near your turret and let your jungler know so he can counter gank. Still, sometimes none of the above works and you just can't stop feeding. That's okay too. Try to roam and play around the strong members of your team. Build supportive and peel for the fed members of your team. It's important that when losing, you don't go for huge plays unless you absolutely know they'll work. Oftentimes you'll be weaker than you expect and you will cause an even bigger disadvantage for yourself. Losing gracefully and getting carried are key abilities in League. Next we'll talk about objectives. Zyra is the queen of objective control, both offensively and defensively. If you're defending a turret or trying to stop a dragon or baron, you can use your plants to poke the enemy out, making sure to always have at least one seed in reserve in case a fight breaks out. If you're sieging a turret or trying to take an objective, set up your passive seeds to give a ferocious disengage if the enemy forces, or simply take the tower or dragon if they don't. Zyra is almost never the champion to force something unless you can surprise from Fog of War. Her disengage is much stronger than her engage. Teamfighting as Zyra is very interesting and very dynamic depending on the situation and team composition. Sometimes you want to destroy carries, sometimes you want to peel tanks and kite back. The important thing to be aware of is who the threats are in the enemy team and where the damage is. Protect your team and either kill or zone theirs. This is an incredibly important thing to be aware of as Zyra. Sometimes zoning an enemy out of a fight is just as effective as killing that member. For example, if the enemy team has a lot of divers like Aurelia and Zed, you can use your spells on the members that dive and position your ult in the middle of their team over your plants to split up the fight. Their carries can't walk through your ultimate and your plants, and this gives your entire team time to take down their front line. If the front line is squishy, 9 times out of 10, that will be where you should focus. If their front line is tanky but deals very little damage, you can save your spells for the more threatening members of their team. It's all about being aware of the strengths and exploiting the enemy team's weaknesses. Don't be afraid to kite back and focus different members depending on the situation. The best way to do this is to always ask yourself what you should be doing and never do the same thing every time just because. Looking at items and KDAs can also help a lot in figuring out strengths. Alright, so that's it for Zyra in the game. We'll close the guide with some tips and tricks that you can do with Zyra. One of the coolest and most effective tips is blocking skill shots with plants. The best way to do this is to EW towards your opponent, placing your W close to you in order to spawn instantly and blocking the skill shot. I use this most commonly against Thresh because it's predictable, but with practice this can be used against Blitzcrank hooks, Ahri charms, Lee Sin Qs, LeBlanc chains, and really anything that can be blocked with minions. For example, you can't use this against Fizz or Jhin ults, as those pass through minions. Another great trick is using your plants to detonate traps, including Teemo Shrooms, Jhin Lotuses, and Shaco Boxes. Just make sure you aren't standing near them when you do it. There are a lot more subtleties and things to do when playing Zyra, but as this guide is already quite long, I'll leave them in the text guide, which is the best resource for finding more information as well as updated information as the patches continue. And that's pretty much it. I actively focus on teaching Zyra, so don't hesitate to ask me if you have any questions. You can stop by on my stream, you can ask me on Twitter, or you can ask me in the comments below the video. I'm also on Reddit a lot, on the main League of Legends subreddit, on the Summoner School subreddit, and also the Zyra main subreddit. Alright, thank you everyone for watching, and may your enemies feel the thorns embrace. Politely, of course.